They sold the house while I was at the market. A postcard arrived, and the life I knew was suddenly someone else. Single quotes, is thought. Hello, my name is Evelyn Hart. If you know a home by the smell of the lemon oil in the kitchen, or by the way a clock chimes on the hour, then you know the house I'm talking about. It had a porch with a light that always flickered at dusk, and a maple in the backyard that kept time like an old friend. It was ordinary in the ways ordinary things are sacred, the kind of place where recipes gather flour on the corners and children leave fingerprints on the windowsill. I will tell this story slowly, because it deserves a slow telling. It begins, oddly enough, at the grocery store. I went for vegetables, as I had 100 times, with the list in my pocket and the habit of humming to myself. When I came back, there was a postcard on the kitchen table, small, printed, and dry, as if someone had pressed a piece of yesterday into a book. It said, plainly, sold. The letters on that card felt like a hand in the middle of a familiar sentence, changing its meaning. For a moment I thought it must be a mistake. If you're new here, and if you are, consider subscribing. We tell these stories because ordinary lives matter. We stitch little things into larger maps. The first mornings after that postcard felt like the world had shifted a few degrees. I would sit at the kitchen table where my husband had once sorted the mail and count the empty places. He had been gone a few years by then, and grief had gradually become a companion rather than a storm. The things a person leaves behind, a favorite mug, a battered frying pan, a clock that chimes, they become the lineaments of a life. Those things are what I thought of as I read the card, as if the act of reading heartened me enough to find answers. People ask me often how you know when a house is home. I tell them, it's the small things. It's the dent of a spoon on the side of a bowl. It's the way the curtains always hang imperfectly because someone in the family was in a hurry and called someone's name just as the light struck the glass. To me, home is a ledger. It's a list of tiny, human things that accumulate into a life. My husband and I had built most of our ritual here. He brewed coffee in exactly the same way every morning, measuring his grounds with the thumb and the first two fingers. He whistled off-key and pretended not to hear when one of the children dropped a plate. We planted the maple when our first grandchild came into the world, and we carved initials on a slat beneath the pantry shelf. The summer the kids learned to skate in the driveway. None of that was impressive in the way world cares about impressive things, but it was the architecture of our days. Grief changed some of the arrangements. People came with casseroles and left with promises. The children would call more in the winter and less in the spring, as seasons of life took them into new rhythms. I did not think their absence meant they had forgotten the house. I assumed someone would remember the mantle, the glasses, the ways to measure flour without thinking. For a while, that assumption held. Then it did not. I called my son the afternoon I found the postcard. I remember how his voice sounded polite, a little clipped, like someone trying to fit a difficult thing into a short word. He asked me to breathe and said we thought it was for the best. Those words felt like a small excision. The act had been framed as a kindness. To some, kindness is a practical arrangement. To me, kindness requires conversation and presence. It requires that the person who lives inside the house is included in decisions that change the life contained beneath the roof. It is difficult to explain how ordinary betrayals cut differently. A brick is a brick, but a brick taken from the wall of the place you built together feels like a removal of weight you used to lean against. I could trace the sale in small signs the way you track the weather. A new mailbox, a fresh lick of paint, a moving truck left at the curb. I checked online, and the records were their names and dates and forms. The sequence of signatures made the change official. The law does not measure memory. The law measures ownership. I write letters when I have to collect my own history. The first letter I wrote after that postcard was not angry. It was an inventory of small things. I wrote about the recipe box with its flour-smudged cards, about the quilt my mother had sewn, about the mantle with its photographs in mismatched frames. The letter said, remember. It asked for a meeting. It asked for the courtesy of a conversation. Those requests seemed, to me, of the most basic kind. Sometimes the simplest requests are the hardest to give. When I mailed that letter, I imagined the right outcome, a cup of tea and a conversation in which we would measure grief and make a small plan. That is not what happened at once. There were polite responses, short calls that skirted the heart of the issue. People will use phrases to wrap difficult acts in gentleness. We thought we were helping, and we were only trying to make life simpler. Do you know how it feels when someone makes a life simpler without asking the person who lived it? It is like trimming a beloved old tree to make it tidy for a stranger's eye. A neighbor, Mrs. Robinson, who has lived 2 doors down since forever, brought me stew in an old enamel pot and sat on my porch as we watched the maples drop their leaves. She remembers faces and stories. She said, "They mean well." That sentence can be balm if paired with presence. It is cold if it becomes a shield for omission. I took the stew and listened. Listening is a small kind of action that can keep things from dissolving into loss. There are practicalities to this sort of grief. I went to the title office and read pages that smelled of toner and authority. The deed was clean. The buyers had every right to change the wallpaper and the locks. Law is a blunt instrument in a world of delicate human things. That realization hardened some days for me. It also taught me that there are two separate projects when you lose a house. One is legal, and the other is archival. The law will tell you who owns, the archive will tell you who remembers. And so I began to build an archive. I scanned photographs. I wrote down names. I listed the things I wanted to keep: the mantel clock, the recipe box, the quilts that smelled of lavender. I wrote more letters, some shorter, some longer. I learned to be specific in the smallest way. I asked, plainly, for 2 hours to come and gather certain items. I wanted a brief time to touch what I had helped make. There is dignity in a small farewell. When the appointment was set and the certified mail stamped received, I dressed in the scarf my husband had given me and went with Mrs. Robinson to the house. It felt in many ways like entering a church where someone else had started a service. The paint was new, the porch looked staged, and the new owners moved through the rooms with a kind of tender efficiency. Their children's toys lay piled in a corner where, once, our children had left blocks. It is strange and tender to watch new feet learn to make familiar paths. A woman named Alice greeted us and showed us through with a professionalism that was not hostile. She had plans for skylights and a fresh kitchen. She said the word potential a few times, and I understood in my bones how different the world looks when you imagine a place as a project rather than as an archive. She did not mock. She simply had her own sequence of affections for the house. We collected the things I had asked to take: the clock, the photo album, the pan my husband favored for Sunday mornings. When she handed me the mirror that had come down from the attic, her hands were careful in the way someone who wants to honor the past might be careful. That small attentiveness felt like a truce. Not all returns are neat. A portrait did not resurface. A box of letters went missing. I imagine them now like birds flown to some other roof. Objects travel and, sometimes, they find new lives. That thought is small comfort and small sorrow. You cannot always bring back everything, but I could bring back enough to hold a story together, and enough to teach my granddaughter the smell of yeast in the morning and how to fold a napkin so it looks like a small white sail dot in the months that followed. I learned practical things: how to keep receipts of correspondence, how to get certified mail, how to make a list of artifacts with descriptions. Practicalities give you footholds. You may not change a deed, but you can make sure your voice is recorded. My friends at the library offered to digitize a few albums. A college student volunteered to make a small archive of neighborhood photographs. Small communities can be mighty in long games. There were soft moments too. Once a neighbor left a pancake pan at my door with a note: "Found this in a box, thought of you. I keep that pan on my stove now, and when I use it the sound is like a little bridge." In another moment, I found an old recipe card shoved into the pages of a book and discovered handwriting I thought had been erased by time. Those small recoveries felt like gifts from strangers and family alike, and there were long conversations with my son that turned into small maps. Apology here, confusion there, explanation in small doses. He told me about debt and pressure and being frightened about the upkeep. He did not mean to be cruel. People who love you can also make choices that wound when they think they are protecting you. That is one of the human paradoxes. Love and error can live next door. I chose, slowly, to hold both the disappointment and the tenderness in the same hands. When you have lived a long time, you learn that stories can be taught. I taught my granddaughter how to make peach cobbler and why we always stir counterclockwise. She learned to hum my husband's off-key music and to call me at 3 when she misses something small. Rituals are ways to make time keep the things we decide matter. This is a part of recovery that is seldom dramatic, but it is durable. So that is how the first act of this story ended, with a postcard, a letter, and a slow sequence of choices: legal, personal, and archival. I asked for what I could in the language I had: polite, steady, and precise. The letter was not a plea for revenge. It was a request for recognition. In the next part of the story, I will tell you about the times that took that request seriously, the moments when people showed kindness in surprising ways, and the practical things I did to protect what I could. I will tell you about community, about scanning tapes and making a small book of memories, and how, slowly, we stitched a new map to hold the old. When I began to document the small things, I felt less at the mercy of other people's choices. Names and dates on a page are not a shield against loss, but they are a kind of map. If someone later asks what happened, you can point to the map and say, "Here, this is where we placed the things that matter." It is a modest kind of dignity, but dignity is often found in modest things. The sale had its own logical trail, a listing, an agent who spoke in numbers, and a closing date that belonged to the calendar more than two people. I watched the sequence from the margins as if I had been given a printed script. There were meetings I was not invited to, calls I did not get, and a sense that decisions had been made in rooms where my voice never sounded. The modern world has an efficiency that can feel like erasure if you are not at the table. You might think the worst thing was the sale itself, but that was only the beginning. I started to learn how to use words to pull things back into reach. My letters changed. I wrote with more precision. "Please return the mantel clock, the album with the red cover, and the blue pan with the chip on the handle." I sent these letters certified because I wanted a record. When the photocopy of the receipt came back, it felt like a narrow kind of victory. Paper said someone took my request and put it down in a file. That is a small comfort, but it is a comfort nonetheless. There were small, surprising acts of kindness. A young man who delivered groceries in our neighborhood asked if I was the one with the old recipe box. He had been told the story by a neighbor. He came back the next week with a recipe card he'd scavenged while helping to clean out a garage. He had no obligation. He had simply been curious. There is a kind of modern neighborliness that resembles the old kind, people sharing what they find rather than what they profit from. Those little returns, a card, a pan, a framed photo, stitch you back with thread. But there was also friction. My son, Tom, oscillated between contrition and a kind of awkward distance. He would call and ask about a recipe, and then hang up without acknowledging the hole left by the sale. We navigated those calls like two people tracing a map where the landmarks had been changed. Sometimes the conversation would open into a place of warmth. Other times it would slam shut. I had to be honest with myself. Part of the ache was practical. Houses need upkeep. And in a world of rising taxes and small incomes, the calculation to sell a property is not always malicious. It felt as if the selling was part economics and part exhaustion. My son was not evil. He was a man tired and pressed by responsibility. Understanding that softened some edges without erasing the wound. And then I found a transfer receipt that made my stomach drop. I discovered, in one of the stacks of documents I obtained, an internal note from the agent that referenced a buyer who had requested an Aziz sale for expediency. The phrase meant the agent had marketed the house with urgency. There were notes about a strategy to attract renovators, and a mention of a deadline, a closing date that lined up with a weekend when I had been in town visiting a friend. Deadlines have a way of making decisions irreversible. They are like tides. Once the tide goes out, the land looks different. I called the agent. He was efficient and apologetic. He explained the process with a kind of detached competence. That kind of competence can feel like oil poured over a wound. It smooths but does not heal. He told me the buyers were excited and had plans for opening up the kitchen and putting in new floors. I pictured rooms stripped of the little scars that had made them ours, and felt my throat tighten. As the new owners began renovations, the house changed in ways both small and dramatic. The paint was lighter. The porch swing was taken down and repainted. They measured for a skylight where once there had been a patch that my husband had fixed with a piece of tin and a prayer. To them, these were improvements. To me, they felt like an erasure of the informal repairs that marked our family's competence and care. You might expect an immediate confrontation, but often change comes in quiet increments. One afternoon, a group of neighbors came together and wrote a small note to the new owners. We told them about the annual block party and the way the maple always shaded the picnic table. We wrote about the cookouts and how, years ago, someone had built a birdhouse that still hangs on the east side. We tried to make a bridge between our memories and their project. The letter was not a demand. It was an offering of context. I think some of our neighboring memories are like heirlooms, suddenly shared and suddenly public. there was also an institutional lesson. I went to the library and found past editions of the neighborhood paper. I scanned articles, clipped columns, and took photographs of old notices. The library staff were kind. They knew the neighborhood and they knew how quickly stories can be lost. The archivists digitized some photographs for me and made a small folder where the house's history could be stitched into community memory. That album became a small repository that I could point to when I needed something to prove that the house was more than a structure. It gets worse before it gets better. There was an evening when I received a voicemail that unsettled me. The voicemail was from an unfamiliar number. The voice left a short message that sounded rehearsed, like someone reading from a script. This is to inform you that renovations are proceeding as planned. Please respect the property and refrain from entering the lot without permission. It was a polite warning that felt like a barrier. The message implied that I might be tempted to trespass in sentimental fury. It is an odd thing to be warned away from one's own memories. That voicemail made me realize I needed allies. I reached out to a neighborhood attorney recommended by a friend. She listened and then suggested a measured path: documentation, polite requests, and an inventory of items to claim. She reminded me that lawsuits are costly and often hollow victories. She recommended practical things: certified letters, inventories with photos, and a calm tone in communications. The advice was steady and useful. I also learned the limits of adult children. My son was caring in his own ways. He brought casseroles. He called in the evenings. He came to drop off my groceries sometimes. But decisions made in the name of protection can become strangling. I learned to name what I needed without making him the villain. That involved uncomfortable talk, but it also opened small windows of compassion. He was not the enemy. He was a person who had made choices under pressure. You won't believe what I found tucked behind a page in an old cookbook. One evening, while cleaning through a stack of recipes, I found a small folded note hidden between pages. The handwriting was not mine. It was my husband's in a hurried script. It read, "If anything happens, keep the pan with the chip. It's good for eggs." Things like that. Small, mundane instructions are weighty. They feel like evidence that a life was tended with care. I put that note in an envelope and mailed it to my granddaughter, with a little annotation about which pan to use and how to butter the top just so. Those are ways to keep someone tethered to a past that seems to slip. Friendship became a lifeline. Women from the support group started visiting more regularly. We made a rota of tea and conversation. One woman who had once been a teacher volunteered to help me organize boxes and write small labels. Another suggested that I make a small oral history recording for the grandchildren. We sat with a recorder and told stories about the first stove, about where the dog liked to bury bones, about a time the oven caught a rag on fire and someone screamed and someone else laughed. These stories are the mortar between the bricks of a family. Then came an unexpected moment that softened the whole season. Alice, the new owner, phoned one afternoon. She had been clearing a box and discovered a set of old photographs, sepia-tinted and faded. She asked if I would like to see them. We arranged a time and she drove them over carefully, wrapped in brown paper. I sat on the sofa and opened the bundle as if unwrapping a memory. There, among faces I recognized, a cousin with a hat askew, a child with elbows on the table, was a photo of my husband in his 20s, grinning, with a sock puppet on his hand. Seeing that picture was like finding a voice I thought had been stilled. That small exchange changed the tenor between us. She confessed she had felt a bit guilty about the way the sale had unfolded, and that she wanted to include family memorabilia in a small history wall she was planning. We talked for a long time about paint choices and the way light lands on the mantel in the late afternoon. She asked questions with curiosity rather than the cold efficiency of the agent's checklist. That curiosity felt like a bridge. But there were also setbacks. A box of letters I had hoped to recover was gone. A cousin called to say a portrait had appeared in an online auction catalog. A distant relative had bought it years ago, and now it had surfaced elsewhere. The losses are uneven. Some things return as gifts. Others feel like theft. In those moments, I had to choose between rage and acceptance. Rage can be righteous, but it also consumes the person who carries it. I chose, often imperfectly, to conserve my energy for actions that could matter. The legal advice I received was both practical and bittersweet. My attorney friend encouraged me to formalize what I had already been doing. Write down the items I wanted, create a photographic inventory, and keep copies of every letter sent and received. She said, "If anything becomes contestable later, you will have the record." Having that record made me feel less vulnerable. It gave me a kind of textual backbone. Community efforts continued. The library exhibit drew attention, and people posted memories online. A neighbor's comment about my husband's chili recipe drew a small crowd who remembered bringing his dish to church suppers. Those moments of shared memory made me feel less alone. It is a strange thing to watch your private life become public in a comforting way. There was a moment when I realized the fight was not against people but against forgetting. I started a small ritual. Every Sunday evening I would call my granddaughter, and we would tell one story together. She would tell me about her week, and I would tell her about a day when the dog got loose and led a parade down Maple Street. Sometimes we would laugh until our stomachs ached. Sometimes she would ask questions I could not answer. We recorded those sessions and labeled them with dates. They are small treasures now. And then one quiet morning, I received a letter from the new owners. It was not a legal document. It was a handwritten note saying, "We found the recipe box. We would like to return a few items we think belong with the family. Would you come by?" I read that note 3 times. My hands trembled because paper sometimes has a kindness that email does not. It felt like the beginning of a different way forward. We set a time, and when I arrived, Alice was there with a small stack of things she had found. We sat in her kitchen with a pot of tea, and she apologized. Not theatrically, but with a concrete humility. We didn't know what we were taking, and we wish we had asked. Apologies are not guarantees. They are gestures that open a door. I accepted the apology and took back the little items that mattered most to me, and I left with a lighter apron and an odd mixture of sadness and relief. These months taught me that the arc of repair is long and not always linear. There were days of anger, days of quiet victory, and days when I simply felt exhausted. I am a practical woman. I organized, I wrote, I asked for receipts. Those steps kept me steady. But there were also the unpractical things, the laughter with neighbors, the cobbler my granddaughter baked, the way light fell across a photo. Those things turned the archive of loss into a new living story. If you think the hardest part was losing the house, wait. There is a moment when you must choose how to live afterwards, and that moment is its own kind of quiet battle. After the tea with Alice and the careful return of a few items, it would have been easy to imagine a straight slope back to ordinary life. Life sometimes offers that, but often it gives a series of steps sideways and back again. I had to find a rhythm in which to continue being me, while the world around my old house rearranged itself. That work was quieter and slower than any dramatic courtroom scene. It took patience and planning and small bits of courage. One afternoon, while going through a box of letters for the library archive, I found a note from my husband I had missed the first time. It was written in his shorthand, and it simply said, "Remember to keep the rhythm. Don't forget the songs." I read that line and felt a warmth go through me, like a hand on a cold morning. We had always been people of habits, songs, recipes, routines. That note became a talisman for the months that followed. The note wasn't just comfort. It would become the spark for an idea that changed everything. I began to create a small oral history project. I called it Kitchen Stories and asked neighbors and friends to come and tell one memory each. We recorded these into a small device and gave copies to everyone who wanted one. The recordings began with small things: the smell of biscuits, a joke about a dog who ate birthday cake, a memory of a snowstorm when a car got stuck on our lane. They were imperfect recordings, coughs, laughter, children in the background, but they were alive. The project became a way to anchor memories outside of the walls that had been sold. It was also a way to gather witnesses. In a community, witnesses matter. They can testify not in court, but in the archive of memory. That archive does not undo a sale, but it does make a life legible in a way that matters. When a neighbor or a friend can say, "I remember this," the story gains longevity. Memory is not only a personal thing, it is social. It travels by telling. Then, a stranger reached out with an offer that surprised us all. A woman named Carmen, who ran a small historical society a town over, heard about our kitchen stories and offered to include our little archive in a regional exhibition of neighborhood histories. She said she wanted to showcase small lives and the gifts that get passed down without much fanfare. Suddenly, what had been a private stitching became a public display. For some that felt intrusive, for me it felt like a widening of the circle. It felt like permission to say, this mattered. Preparing for the exhibit gave me purpose and a place to put my grief. One selected a few photographs, a recipe card, and a small note from my husband. I wrote captions in careful handwriting. I taught my granddaughter how to write placards with dates. The day the exhibit opened, people read our small placard and nodded. A woman in her 80s came up to me and said quietly, "Your tree was where my husband carved his initials years ago." Those small overlaps, the way a neighbor's memory crosses your own, stitch things together. But as the public thread grew, so did private tensions. My son found the publicity awkward. He preferred private solutions. We argued briefly, awkwardly, about whether making the story public would embarrass him. He was worried about what neighbors would think about the choices he'd made. I listened and said, simply, "I want our life to be told honestly." He was not wrong to be nervous. I was not wrong to seek a witness. Families are always balancing reputations and truth. The next twist came from an unexpected source. A deed discrepancy. In the stack of documents I had photocopied at the county office, a small notation caught my eye. It was a marginal comment from a recording clerk etched in faint ink. Possible missing exhibit. It was the sort of tiny bureaucratic phrase that could mean a lot. I took it to the county office again and asked to see the original packet. The clerk was kind and polite, and after a little search pulled a yellowed envelope. Inside were attachments, a hand-signed note, and a receipt that had not made it into the digitized record. The signatory was a distant relative who, years before the sale, had been given a temporary power of attorney to manage some affairs. The piece of paper suggested there might have been an incomplete chain of consent. It is surprising how small things can open big doors. I took copies of that note to my attorney friend. She squinted at it and said, "This may be something we can ask to have examined more carefully." Legal language is often slow-moving and cautious, but it can be precise. We filed a polite request for review with the county. The request did not imply wrongdoing. It asked for a procedural check. In the best of worlds, a check would mean clarity and the quiet satisfaction of a documented truth. While the county reviewed the materials, I continued with rituals. I taught my granddaughter how to fold a napkin into a fan shape, and how to butter the top of a cobbler in a way that made the crust golden. I read letters aloud to the Kitchen Stories volunteer team, and we laughed at jokes. My husband had scribbled in the margins of an old grocery list, "Memory, practiced frequently, becomes a resilient kind of living." Then came the visit that changed how I thought about forgiveness. Alice invited me to a small dinner with her family and some neighbors. It felt awkward at first. We all sat around a table and she apologized in a way that was neither performative nor legalistic. She said plainly that she wished she had asked more questions and that the sale process had been quick. Her child, who had been born while we were in the early months after the sale, reached for the same sugar bowl my mother used to keep on the table. For a moment, a small human interchange bridged the distance between past and present. We passed around pie and traded stories. It did not heal everything, but it made a kind of repair. There are times in life when the practical and the emotional meet in ordinary gestures, handing over a plate, sitting down for dinner, asking about a photograph you find in a drawer. Those small gestures accumulate into trust if they are repeated. I did not mistake gestures for restitution, but I accepted them as part of living in the same neighborhood. The county's review led to a discovery that surprised everyone. After a slow, procedural period, the county clerk called me to say they had found an attachment that had not been recorded in the digitized system. The attachment included a handwritten note suggesting a misunderstanding in the transfer process. It did not automatically cancel the sale, but it raised questions about whether certain signatures had the full authority claimed. My heart beat fast when I heard the clerk's voice. It was the sort of feeling that mixes hope with the old, careful fear. We asked politely for a fuller review. The process was formal and bureaucratic. My attorney wrote a letter that was calm and grounded. We did not make accusations. We asked for checks. The request was a strategy to clarify, not to condemn. Legal processes can be long and slow, but they are also capable of clarifying ambiguity when asked to do so. In the meantime, life continued its small work. I was to be part of the regional exhibit, and the mayor of our little town asked to visit. He came, and he listened for a long time as I recounted who had fixed the fence and who knitted what at the church fair. He told me afterward that these stories mattered to the town's sense of itself. That felt comforting in a civic way. Public recognition is not always the weather of private grief, but it does make a life more visible. Then came a phone call from my son that changed the tone of our conversations. One evening he called and said, simply, "Can we talk? I think I made some mistakes." His voice sounded thin and very sincere. We met in a cafe, and he told me about the pressure he had been under, about credit offers and an agent who encouraged a quick sale. He did not ask to undo everything. He asked to be honest with me and to help in whatever way he could now. That honesty was the beginning of something like repair. We agreed to work together to make sure certain items were preserved and to keep channels of communication open. There were still dark nights. There were times I found myself driving past the house and feeling a tightness in my chest. There were late evenings when the silence in my apartment felt like a weight. But those nights also gave me room to collect the things I needed. The dinner recipes, the photos, a few letters. I made a plan to keep those things safe. I cataloged them, photographed them, and made duplicates. Practical care is often the best antidote to feeling powerless. The matter of the missing portrait had a resolution I did not expect. A cousin in another state found the portrait at an estate sale and bought it, intending to return it. She wrote to tell me she had found it and wanted to give it back. She drove 3 hours and handed me the frame wrapped in old newspaper. The portrait looked a little battered and the varnish had yellowed, but the face was ours again. Tears come in odd ways, sometimes in private, sometimes at the sight of a familiar chin in paint. I set the portrait on my mantel and it felt like a small reclaiming. Those small reclamations taught me something about the reach of family and the kindness of strangers. Communities are made from more than they are made from the willingness of people to carry things home for you. I held that portrait and thought of all the hands that had held it in the interim. The county review finally concluded with a clarification that altered a few of the premises. The county sent a formal note explaining that the transfer documents had included an error in the paperwork of a distant relative who had earlier been given a limited power of attorney. The paperwork meant that some of the signatures required additional documentation to be fully effective. The county did not order a reversal of the sale. Such actions are rare and complicated, but the finding did require a clarification and an amendment to the record. In the end, what mattered to me was not legal victory. It was clarity. It was a paper trail that accurately represented what had happened. Clarity brought some peace. It did not restore every object, nor did it make every conversation easy. What it did do was force a more careful accounting of decisions and give us a shared language to discuss what had occurred. When people can speak about facts rather than about insinuations, the conversation changes. The months after the clarification felt less like a battle and more like the slow craft of living. My son and I rebuilt a pattern of calls and regular visits. The new owners and I had an exchange of objects and stories, and occasionally I would bring a plate of cookies and sit on the porch while their child waved at me from the yard. We did not erase the past. We made a small accommodation. I kept my archives and my letters and made sure my granddaughter had the recipes saved in a book I had written for her. In the end, the thing that mattered most was not an object but a rhythm. I learned that the heart's geography can be reshaped without losing its core. The house remained a house somewhere down the street, painted and renewed. Its windows still caught the sun in the same way in the afternoons. The mantel now held different faces among old frames. My life fit into a new rhythm in a smaller place, with a shelf for the clock and a corner for the quilt. There is dignity in choosing how to continue. For me, that looked like teaching recipes, telling stories, and keeping lists of the little things I wanted to preserve. It looked like making an oral history so that grandchildren would always hear the voice of a man who whistled off-key while making coffee. It looked like forgiving in ways that kept my own heart unburdened while not excusing the choices that caused pain. I want to offer you 3 practical steps if you find yourself in a similar place. First, make an inventory. Photograph what matters, list it in writing, and keep copies of everything. Second, use certified mail for important requests. It creates a trail. Third, gather witnesses, neighbors, librarians, folks who remember. Memory carried by community is harder to erase. As the season moved toward a kind of ordinary, I found new rituals. I would walk to the park and feed the birds in the morning. I would call my granddaughter at precisely 4 o'clock to hear about school. I would make a little album of cutout recipes and tuck notes in the margins. I found that life's smallness is not a defeat, it is a kind of careful artistry. When people ask me whether I am angry, I answer honestly. Sometimes, yes, anger is a real and fair feeling in the face of loss. But I also want to live in the generous half of things. I want to teach my granddaughter to fold napkins and to taste crusts for the right amount of salt. I want to keep writing letters that say, plainly, remember us. This story is not about a lawsuit. It is about memory and how to care for it. If you take anything from this story, let it be this. Speak now, while you can. Write down the little things. Tell someone precisely where the keys are and what the recipe cards mean. These steps are not dramatic, but they are powerful. Thank you for listening. If you have a house story, a recipe, or a small memory you want to share, please write it below. These stories are how ordinary lives keep moving forward. If you liked this story, consider subscribing. There are many more quiet lives we will tell together. And if you have someone who might need to hear something gentle today, send them a note. It will matter. Good night.